So, Eyes Wide Shut has Todd Field in it as an actor, and Sidney Pollack, who directed They Shoot Horses, Don't They, among other things. He's also here as an actor, but this is not a Todd Field film or a Sidney Pollack film. It's Stanley Kubrick. Eyes Wide Shut is Kubrick's last film, you probably know, and some would say that it's his finest. In some ways, I think it is. This is a great movie. This movie came out in 1999, right after Kubrick had died. There's some controversy about the final edit of the film. There's some conspiracism about it as well. I won't be talking about that because, honestly, I really don't care. In some ways, it's hard to believe that Kubrick was making movies in the 90s, in 1999. Almost made it to the new millennium. His career started in the 50s. It's hard to believe that Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman would be in one of his movies, or Todd Field, for that matter. It's a bit like Paul Newman appearing in a Hitchcock film, or Robert De Niro appearing in a movie with Burt Lancaster the same year that he was in a movie with Jodie Foster. Just some sort of time warps in cinema. This movie is remarkably cutting edge. In fact, if it weren't for a few phone booths and flip phones, you might think this movie came out this year. Okay, there's a few scenes that might be a little bit different today, and maybe some lingering undercurrents of classic cinema and traditionalism or something. I'll talk about this a bit more. Now, I try to avoid saying that a film is well made or well done in particular, because it really doesn't mean anything to say that. But with Eyes Wide Shut, I think well made might really be the right term. I've seen a lot of movies, and there are few that are as finely tuned as this. And you would hope, given how long it took to make it, given it's the culmination of the career of one of the greatest directors. I'm going to try and talk about a lot of specifics here, places where I think it's well made. Hate to say it. Of course, this doesn't mean that Eyes Wide Shut shoots to the top of my favorites list. It doesn't, in fact. But I don't really have much negative to say about the movie. Maybe Tom Cruise is slightly too mopey, slightly too hard to read. The use of the flashback, perhaps, a bit heavy-handed. Todd Field actually isn't very good in this movie, and this character seems a little bit out of touch. There are minor things here and there, but that's about it. It is worth noting that throughout his career, Kubrick made fairly accessible movies. 2001 tends to be a bit lost on modern audiences, I guess, but otherwise, most of his films will appeal to most of today's somewhat more mature filmgoers. Of course, to me, this is a bad thing. I jest, but to be honest, most of my favorite movies are less accessible movies. Movies that focus all their energy on expressing complex ideas and very little of their energy on making sense or being exciting. This is one reason why I've been slow to watch some of Kubrick's films and why I'm only just getting to Eyes Wide Shut now. Of course, for the most part, accessibility is a strength. Don't we want movies to be fun to watch, to be enjoyable? And Eyes Wide Shut, it is those things. It will probably keep most people engaged. At the same time, it has some real depth. More than most of Kubrick's films, the plot here, 2001 being the exception, the plot of Eyes Wide Shut isn't really that important, I guess. Eyes Wide Shut isn't so much a tightly wound thriller as it is a more general treatise on sexuality. I guess there are two main angles you could think about, the first being that sex is all around us. This is the part where you open your eyes and see that behind every door, even the really fancy doors, even the really important doors, behind every door, people are thinking about sex. The second angle is more about institutions, like marriages, laws, Christmas, secret societies, institutions. In some ways, this is the part where you close your eyes. Now, there's more to it than just these two pieces, but I think that's a decent starting point for thinking about the movie, something to think about if you haven't seen it yet. The movie opens up with Bill and Alice going to a fancy party. And at first, it's not really clear what the movie is going to be about. Are we just going to be dancing around at a party the whole time, seeing the somewhat mild romantic dissonances between the two halves of this couple? There's some old Hungarian guy there who starts flirting with Alice. Bill is talking to some models. It turns out that this party will threaten to unravel their relationship entirely, but not in an obvious way or in any kind of linear fashion. There's some brief blurbs about this movie that you'll find, maybe on IMDb, I forget where exactly, will say that, like, oh, they go to a party and it changes their lives or something like that. Well, it's not exactly, like I said, it's not exactly linear, but looking back, this is sort of where things start to unravel a little bit. So far, we're at the party and not a lot has happened. In the movie, the pace starts out a little slow. Of course, Kubrick could make watching paint dry enjoyable. Bill, after too long, is asked to come upstairs for a moment, and it turns out that Ziegler, this is Sidney Pollack, who's the host of the party and who is one of Bill's patients, Bill's doctor, is with a woman who has just overdosed, and it seems like Ziegler probably raped her. This is where the movie gets going, not because it's gratuitous or intense or over the top or anything, but because here we have one of the first examples of the two angles that I mentioned. We have this super fancy party, the embodiment of institution, and upstairs we have something totally immature and chaotic. Interesting. Here we start to see, this is going to be a movie about stuff. Cool. You could also talk about the movie in terms of the public and private lives. We're going to move between these two a lot in this movie. And a doctor, particularly a doctor with a lot of rich clients, and a doctor who makes house calls to a lot of fancy apartments, is in some ways the perfect person to go between these worlds, the public and the private. In some ways, a doctor is totally committed to the truth. On the other hand, doctors have only a particular toolbox to find it with. Kubrick was apparently very negative about doctors, very skeptical about doctors in his own life. Like most of the major characters in this film, Bill is a very well-balanced character. I think this starts from casting. In my opinion, casting is actually one of Kubrick's greatest strengths. It's not talked about enough. People talk about the cinematography, obviously, things like that. But I think in some ways, what he really was good at, of course he was good at many things, but one thing he was just amazing at was casting. Now, of course, he spent a million years casting this movie. Originally wanted Rudy Valentino in the main role. But he got it right. And he did some things that are really smart and that a lot of people wouldn't do, including casting Tom Cruise and using Tom Cruise in a very particular way. Tom Cruise, I think, is inherently insincere. There always seems to be something a little bit phony about him, a little bit plastic. In most of his movies, this works great because the entire movie is phony and plastic. He fits right in. But I think that Tom Cruise's best roles are the ones where he plays a character that's a little bit fake. Think about the movie Magnolia, for instance, which actually came out in the same year as this one and had Jason Robards in it, believe it or not. There's another time warp for you. There he plays, again, sort of a shallow-ish character in some ways. I think that's where Tom Cruise shines. In the 90s, Tom Cruise was in a few good movies. He was also in A Few Good Men. That probably doesn't fall into this category. Anyway, in Eyes Wide Shut, I think Tom Cruise's insincerity adds a big dimension to the character. There are a few times where he receives some bad news or he has to share some bad news. And you wonder, is he capable of doing that? Is he capable of sincerely expressing remorse, of feeling things? Or is he just going to say something professional like, well, I know this is a difficult time you're going through, right? Is he just going to act? There's something kind of naive about Bill. He gets hung up on things, but he also doesn't really see the writing on the wall. On the one hand, he can get things done. He's got this big wad of cash, and he knows how to use it, and he does seem fairly set on doing the right thing, whatever that is. But also, like I said, he gets so hung up on the littlest things. A very finely balanced character. Now, like I said, he maybe mopes around just a little bit too much, and more importantly, perhaps, it's not always clear what he's thinking. Is he really so affected by his wife's dream that he has to wander around New York alone all the night? Why would he visit this prostitute? Why would he get pulled into this huge mystery? To be fair, he mostly stumbles into these things, but there is still something that I feel like is slightly off. Maybe one piece of the movie that could have used a tiny bit more tuning. When it comes to Alice, we get another finely balanced character. And I think here it's less a case of good casting as it is good acting. Nicole Kidman is great. Her character is great. In general, Alice seems a bit wary of her position in society, aware of the ways that she is objectified. On the other hand, she doesn't really have too many complaints about her upper-class lifestyle. How could she, really? In the party scene in the beginning, we see Alice almost fall under the spell of this high-class Hungarian pickup artist Um, on one hand, it's kind of nice to see her having some fun, and it seems like she's in control. She shuts him down in the end. But on the other hand, she's pretty tipsy, a bit irreverent, and although she escapes, it's not clear that this was guaranteed. There's a somewhat moralistic aspect to this, I guess. We don't really want to see the marriage fall apart. I'll talk about that more, especially when we come to the ending. But it's interesting there. It seems like she's sort of in control and irresponsible at the same time in some ways. One thing I think that's kind of interesting about this movie is how little of an impression the daughter makes on this film. She's in a number of scenes. Alice and Bill do some things that seem like textbook parenting, but the whole thing feels a bit impersonal, feels a bit empty. You forget the daughter was even in the movie in some ways. And there's definitely some sort of hollowness to some degree to Alice's life, I guess. I'll talk about this more, but to round out casting, I just want to say that all the supporting actors in this film are great. Sure, Todd Field has a few corny expressions, and Alan Cumming is a bit over the top, maybe par for the course in 1999. I guess that gay characters in mainstream films have changed a lot in 25-ish years. Audiences maybe don't need such obvious signals anymore, and we've escaped a few stereotypes. Still, in some ways, his character is very charming, but over the top. A lot of characters in this film a lot of actors, I should say, aren't widely hailed. They're mostly character actors, some decently well known. But like I said, Kubrick is great at casting, and he just digs up exactly the right people for even the smallest roles, and it makes the film shine. What can I say? Let's talk about this as a New York movie. I'm contractually stipulated to mention that I live in New York in every video. Oh, by the way, I live in New York. And this is a great New York movie. Stanley Kubrick grew up in New York, so I guess it's not that surprising. The weird thing about this movie is that it was filmed entirely in England. I guess Kubrick developed a fear of flying over his life, although also he just sort of more generally worked in England in this stage of his career. I'm not sure how debilitating his career was, but it fits with whatever Kubrickian character people like to project onto the guy. You would never really suspect that this film wasn't shot on location, although looking back, it kind of makes sense. There's a few street scenes that are just a little bit emptier than normal. When I say that this is a great New York movie, then, I'm not so much talking about the scenery and the geography. The geography really doesn't take center stage. This is not a tourist movie. I don't think you ever see the Empire State Building. We visit the Village fairly often, and it's fairly convincing, although, like I said, slightly barren. The thing that makes this a New York movie for me is the corporate culture that the film incorporates. Now, I'm not really a part of this corporate culture, thankfully, but I'm not a million miles away from it. I have some sense of it, and it just seems to ring so true in this movie. Ziegler and all of his cronies, for instance, really seem to be like the finance bros who grew up, the finance men, I guess you would say. The way that Ziegler acts at the party, the way that Ziegler sits Bill down to give him a fatherly talk about what's going on, to cut the BS, and then proceed to possibly BS him. This seems like exactly the way that these kind of people would behave in the office, right? Exactly this whole corporate New York East Coast business culture. That's it. Kubrick gets this corporate thing so spot on. You wonder if he spent some time moonlighting on Wall Street. Seems pretty unlikely, but you never know. Now, even as we have all these vivid characters and situations, this movie also manages to swerve around just about any cliche that it might start to head towards. Overall, it's a very difficult movie to predict. Even when characters are just talking, it's hard to guess exactly what they're going to say next until they've said it. And once they have, it seems exactly right. That's kind of vague, but Alice especially seems to slither past what you think she's about to say and just phrase things a little bit differently or speak just a little bit differently. There are some parts of this movie that you can find in other movies, but here, something about the way that they're carried off just feels really different. For example, there's kind of a chapter in the film when the loose ends are being cut off. There are plenty of mystery films or noir films, especially, that have a similar feel at times. You know, the detective goes back to the bad guy's hideout and finds that it's been cleaned up. There's nothing there. Kubrick leans into this a little bit, but like I said, it feels really fresh. There's even a scene, where Bill is being followed around on the street. And this is something we've seen a million times, someone being followed. But here, it's just different. Not because it had some outlandish twist at the end to escape. In fact, having an outlandish twist would be a bit cliched in some ways. But because of more subtle refinements, a simple way out that's still unnerving and uncertain. While this is a fairly approachable movie, it's more unconventional than you might first realize. It borrows here and there from the mystery genre, from thrillers. But if you really look into how the plot is functioning, you'll see that it's kind of weird. What is the central conflict? Well, Bill and Alice have their internal lives destabilized a bit when they go to this party, and then they get sucked down into their own mysteries. Don't count on either one of them being solved, Not exactly a conventional structure. Like I said, this is a cutting-edge movie. That said, a lot has changed in the last almost 25 years, especially when it comes to sexuality in the U.S. and how it's expressed and how it's mediated. If this movie came out today, I think there are a few things that would be different. I mentioned the gay concierge at the hotel who's a bit over the top. There's also a scene where Tom Cruise is harassed by some guys on the street who seem to think that he is gay. I guess there were maybe rumors about Tom Cruise at some point, which seems a little quaint. These days, he seems to be sort of a paragon of straight masculinity, middle-aged straight masculinity, perhaps. When I saw this movie, I thought, weird, those guys must not realize that it's Tom Cruise that they're insulting. Of course, actors never exist in the universe of the film that they're in, unless it's John Malkovich. But I think that this kind of encounter, a lot less common in New York now. Homosexuality is somewhat conspicuously featured in this movie. There's a couple other places, too. But I'm not sure there's anything to it exactly, except a hint about yet another kind of sexual expression. I'm not sure. You need to think about that a little more. It's interesting that Alice's dream and the big flashback that she describes is about a naval officer. To me, this sounds like the 1950s. In 1999, someone who's approximately 30 would potentially have elements of traditional America in their fantasies. So it's not totally unrealistic, but I think there's also kind of a deeper point here about latent conventionalism, right? The naval officer that sneaks into the fantasies. At the same time, someone watching today might not think of a naval officer in the same way. Alice always seems to say naval officer, not Navy guy, not sailor, not seaman, naval officer. And she says the whole thing, she really enunciates the role. And I guess the convention, or maybe it's supposed to be a play on words with a naval officer. I don't know. But that's another little element of just a little hint of something more traditional. There's a scene where Bill and Alice get into a bit of an argument. Alice is saying that she can only exist as a sexual object. And the film comes pretty close here to making a political statement. I'm pretty sure that's not what's happening. Alice is pulling on a thread, but it's not clear that she knows exactly where it will end. She has some trouble expressing herself. Like I said at the beginning, Alice, I think, feels the pull of some sort of independence, but also the pull of luxury and her upscale lifestyle. Alice and Bill are both high in this scene. Alice is tipsy at the party. She's often a little bit deluded. On the one hand, pleasure is kind of linked to independence, I guess. And this maybe anticipates a fairly common line of thought today about women's pleasure, that we should embrace it, which maybe is just a reaction to how much it's been stigmatized and policed in the past. Reasonable line of thought, certainly. This is maybe anticipating that. So you're kind of rooting for Alice to enjoy herself. On the other hand, it's maybe no surprise that she has trouble really interrogating her life when she's not entirely lucid for a lot of it. And again, you just get the sense that she's sort of drifting, that she's not really there, and that her so many little acts of rebellion sneak in, like getting drunk, like getting high, or like saying something that's a little bit different than you might expect. Lots of little pieces of rebellion sneak in, but she's kind of drifting through. It's possible, like I said, pleasure is one thing, but it's possible that there's more to life than pleasure, and that this sort of hedonism is only a false independence, particularly when you're at a party or an apartment that is paid for by the patriarchy, right? So I think it's a mistake to take this one speech as Kubrick himself moralizing about objectifying women. I think it's in the movie to represent a certain upper-class cocktail conversation. Of course, there's something to what she's saying, but she's almost lost the ability to take herself seriously as she says it. Today, we're in an era with a lot of preachy movies and also a lot of bad movies, possibly. This is related. And I think that now the speech might distract people or might be read a little bit differently. Like I said, I think the intention is to sort of to show a cocktail conversation of somebody who is not truly politically engaged. But today's audiences might really root for it. I don't know. Or conversely, some people might really roll their eyes at this sort of thing. I think it would be a little bit more distracting. Anyway, audiences might be hoping for a bit more didacticism in this movie than they're going to get. Okay. Now, one thing that annoyed me a little bit about Alice when I was watching the movie is that she isn't really in the movie that much. I hadn't realized that we were mainly going to be watching Tom Cruise run around, as usual, with a few visits to the wife here and there, but he definitely gets more of the action. She has a little bit of a conflict, but it occurs in a dream, come on. That said, when I think back to it, I think there's a way in which Alice's absence speaks pretty loudly. The abandonment of her by Bill and the abandonment of her by the movie imply something about her loneliness and isolation, this life she's sort of drifting through. I would still like to see more of her in the movie because Nicole Kidman is really great in the movie, but like I said, I think the absence speaks. Okay, I want to talk a little bit at the end of the movie. There'll be some spoilers here, but I think the end really ties the room together in this case. At the end of the film, the marriage is more or less reconciled, but at the cost of uncovering sexual temptations and at the cost of really seeing the world as it is, I guess. This is a great twist. Throughout the movie, you are probably rooting for Alice and Bill to keep their relationship strong. You wince when Alice is hit on by the Hungarian, and when it seems like she might reciprocate, even, might be tempted. You worry about Bill putting his family in danger, or about him overreacting to what Alice tells him about her dream. Or, especially when he goes to the prostitute, you wonder what the heck is he doing, putting his family life in jeopardy. So we're sort of rooting for this family life, for this marriage. In general, you are probably hoping for a reconciliation, even as there's these sort of lingering questions about what's really the purpose of this party, what's really the outcome of this hedonistic lifestyle. Why does the parenting seem so shallow? Even as we see all of that, we're still really rooting for this sort of conventionalism. At least I think that's generally what someone would think. We're hoping that Alice and Bill will avoid their temptations and their distractions. And you know what? That's what happens. But when it happens, and when it happens on Christmas, in an upscale toy store, not too far away from me, by the way, it's a bit unsettling. It's not the happy ending exactly that you thought it might be. It's some sort of compromise, it turns out. A return to convention. It's eyes wide shut. This puts a bit of backspin on the entire movie, really. Yeah, they're home free, but Bill calls off his search for the truth. Alice calls off her search for independence. And we're left with something that feels a bit empty, a bit naive. The ending pumps the brakes on the curiosity of the audience, too. We want to figure out the ending of the story. We want to see what's going on at the mansion and all this stuff. We want to know. This is one of a handful of movies about not seeing. A movie about not seeing, which is a beautiful contradiction. Now, when I was watching this movie, I had no idea how it was going to conclude. It seemed unlikely that Kubrick would be able to pull everything together into any kind of coherent finish. You think it's just going to peter out. But turns out a coherent finish is exactly what he delivers. The movie does have a few false endings. It might seem to drag on a little bit, but that simple scene in the toy store really ties a bow around the movie in such an elegant way. Just the work of a master. What can you say? I mean, yeah. That said, there are some lingering ideas, and there isn't any didacticism in the finish, really. If anything, the end is aggressively dialectical, destabilizing any sort of expected narrative endpoint or something like that. So I guess it's no surprise that for a lot of people, there'll still be some things to digest after the movie ends, and I think that's probably part of the idea. Now, I do want to say there is one issue for me with the way the movie functions, one thing that's kind of interesting, and really the way that it sets up an opposition between conventional marriage and the unconventional sex we see in the film of, the orgy, prostitutes, fantasies, etc. right? It ends up having these two things really be put against each other. It ends up really othering unconventional sex, which feels a little bit traditional to me. I think this is one of the few moments in the film where, again, some sort of 1950s moralism sneaks into the movie. And, the naval officer is one thing, but this is a little bit more significant, I think, because it's kind of affects the very structure of the film itself. In this movie, the unconventional sex is seen as being deviant. Married life isn't portrayed very highly either, but the movie still relies on there being an opposition between these two things, and that just feels a little bit rusty to me, and I'm not sure that opposition exists so much today. I don't know. Like I said, this is one place where the movie just feels a little bit mechanical. And it's kind of interesting because otherwise it seems like it's a very naturalistic film that does strike to the core of a lot of the things that it's looking at. But here you just catch a little bit of the mechanics, I think, and I don't know. Obviously, though, I'm a big fan of the movie. It's not exactly my type of movie, but there's few films that can go toe-to-toe with Eyes Wide Shut. There are even a couple of movies with similar-ish focuses that we can think of, and they all fall way, way short. I reviewed Shame, for instance, on this channel, which is a good movie. New York movie about sort of internal sexual life, things like that. Not exactly the same, but, similar territory, kind of. Eyes Wide Shut, way, way better. You might say that American Psycho overlaps in some ways, the way it looks at the corporate culture. Of course, it doesn't in an extremely over-the-top kind of way. Even though that movie is so extreme and over-the-top, I think it speaks less than this movie does. I mean, it's good in other ways, I guess, but again, I think Eyes Wide Shut is just way better. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, fitting for the final film of one of the greatest directors of all time. And if, on the off chance that you have not seen Eyes Wide Shut, and the even slimmer chance that you're still watching this video, get thee to a theater and check it out.